Hello and welcome everyone to Global Minds, the Harvard Alumni for Global Development podcast. This is your host Vivek. Here in Global Minds, we invite global development professionals from different walks of life and talk about their experience of trying to make the world a better place. Today is a very special episode in that we have not one, but three very special guests who are not just exemplary leaders in global development, but also in the Harvard alumni community. So it is with immense pleasure that I welcome Srishti Gupta Narasimhan, Anirudh Suri, and Theodora Skeadas to our podcast today. Thank you so much for joining, all of you. Welcome.
Pleasure. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for
Awesome.
having us.
Great. No, it's a pleasure, real pleasure. First of all, congratulations on your recent nominations to two very important Harvard boards. Srishti, you were nominated as a candidate for the Board of Overseers, which is, in my knowledge, one of two main governing bodies at Harvard and plays a very central role in making sure Harvard continues to deliver excellent education in all different fields. Anirudh and Theo, you both have been nominated as candidates for the Harvard Alumni Association Board of Directors, which is very central to sort of enriching the alumni community and supporting community building, and also performs other important roles such as I think nominating candidates for the Board of Overseers. So that is great. Congratulations.
Thank you, Vivek.
Awesome. And I think just to plug into our listeners who are alumni among them, the elections for the both of the boards that I mentioned are happening right now. And I think this is a great opportunity to know our candidates and vote for the candidate that you want to see in those boards. Is the election happening until May 17th or 16th, I believe?
May 16th.
16th, correct. So I think all alumni have received an email with the link to vote. So if you haven't done yet, please go and vote and stay tuned to listen more about our candidates. I think I'm hoping to ask a lot of questions about what you're hoping to do in those boards and what you've done in the past. So I think this will be an exciting conversation. So getting back to our guests, I think I want to start with you, Srishti, since we've also spoken in the past. And so you've had a very kind of a long and meaningful relationship with Harvard. You were a student for 10 years and you graduated with 4 Harvard degrees, which I hope to come back to later if I get a chance. But I think even after graduating from both the medical school and the Kennedy School in around 2003, you've just been very engaged with the alumni community. You've been an active alumni interviewer. You've been in the Global Advisory Committee. I think you also recently co-chaired the Reunion Committee. So you've just been doing a lot of things and taking leadership positions in the Harvard community. I think I want to start by asking what how do you explain this affinity with Harvard, for like almost 3 decades? What keeps you motivated to just keep engaging with this community and taking on, greater leadership roles in this community?
Thank you, Vivek, for the question. And I agree. There's a bit of an embarrassment of the degrees with 4 degrees from Harvard. But I think one of the things I experienced on campus was a very nurturing and caring environment that was supportive of helping me explore my interests as my interests evolved from biochemical sciences to medicine and finally into global development and global health. And I found my peers, my faculty mentors, and the experience of being able to do work that was cutting edge and very much integrated into complex things that were going on in society. It was so meaningful that I felt sort of incredible gratitude for my education, and I've wanted to give back to the school. One of the things you mentioned is the alumni interviewing. I really love being an international alumni interviewer because I get to meet wonderful students from all around the world. Recently interviewed students from Bangladesh, Indonesia, Canada, and Switzerland. And bringing Harvard to these places outside of the US And bringing students from those places to the US, I think, is a big part of what makes Harvard very special in terms of the community of students. And then I think living and working abroad, both in my career as a consultant and now the last 10 years living and working in Switzerland, I also feel an incredible responsibility to bring global perspectives back to the university. I've lived and worked in Asia and Africa, LATAM, and now I'm in Europe. And I think that I really see Harvard as a global institution, and it's important to keep the perspectives very fresh and continuous, and just how how do the priorities sit outside of the US and how do they sit in other communities, and what are some things that we're looking for, because leadership, I think, from Harvard's perspective as a leader in educating others is critical. And so I see institutions here in Switzerland who are trying to model their programs after how Harvard does things. So that's another reason why I think it's really important to be involved and to stay involved, just because Harvard is under a spotlight for other institutions around the world.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think I want to get back to the point about global education and how important a global perspective is. And I think our other two guests will also have a lot to say about that, given their global background and knowledge. But Anirudh, you've also been very engaged with the alumni community ever since graduating from the Kennedy School, I believe in 2012. I think even when you were a student, you started the Harvard India Student Club, and then I think you were the former president of the Harvard India Council or the India Group. Correct me.
Yeah, Harvard Club of India, Vivek. Yeah.
Right, the Club of India. And then I think you also then transitioned to being the director for the Alumni Association's Asia Pacific region. So I think just you've been taking on greater and larger leadership roles within the alumni community. And now you're looking to be a part of the board of directors for the Alumni Association. So I can see that you clearly see some, in fact, a lot of value in bringing alumni together and coordinating and sort of, making and coordinated effort within the alumni community. I guess I'm curious to ask, what is that value that you really see in bringing Harvard community together? Why do you think it's important, not only for the alumni community, but also to the world?
No, great. Thanks so much, Vivek, first of all, for hosting this podcast and for having us. And I think that's a great question. It's a question that's important for all alumni, actually, because I truly, honestly believe that the Harvard education is not limited to the campus or the time that you spend on campus. Right? I think for all of us who studied at Harvard, I think the value of the education actually increases over time. Right? The classroom experience or the other things that you've done on campus are one aspect of what shaped your personality during the few years you were there. Of course, in Srishti's case, probably a decade that we spent on campus. But I think the value of it really increases over time. And the value is from the community of alumni that you are part of, who can add personal enrichment to your lives, professional opportunities to your career, but also more importantly, for you to continue to learn. Right? To me, one of the key aspects of what Harvard has taught me is that there is no end to your learning, or there cannot be. Right? And the Kennedy School is great actually to imbibe that value in you, because you see students at the Kennedy School who range from, I would say, like 22 years or 23 years, people who are like just fresh out of college, all the way up to like 60 odd years, people who are mid careers or people who've been prime ministers or presidents or ministers or senior bureaucrats and civil servants, right? And you see that they're also coming back to relearn, right? And sometimes unlearn what they've learned. So, me, the Harvard education represents not just the education on campus, but everything else that comes with it beyond. And that's why I think the alumni community is really important, because the alumni community is one way for you to continue to engage with some of the smartest, most committed, most dedicated, and most, I would say, outstanding individuals that you'll otherwise come across. So for me, when I moved back to India after the Kennedy School, and that was in 2014, I realized that I had not had enough, and for me, like, a lot of my friends over the last decade in India have been friends that I made by virtue of my engagement with the Harvard Club of India in Bombay, in Bangalore, in Delhi. And then, as you rightly pointed out, as I assumed the Asia Pacific role for HAA, a lot of my friends now span countries in the Asia Pacific and Europe and LATAM who I met through this, right? So I've met probably more Harvard friends since graduating from Harvard than I did while at Harvard. So for me, that's really the value, right? You continue to build out your personal friendships, professional network, and continue to see what smart, great, dedicated individuals around the world are continuing to do.
Hmm. Absolutely. And that really gives me a lot of hope as a recent alumni,
That's right.
that, I'll get to meet a lot of amazing people. And I already am, I think even this podcast and joining the HAGD, the Harvard Alumni for Global Development, was an opportunity to do just that. So I absolutely agree. And Theo, you're no exception to this. You've also been amazingly taking a lot of leadership role within the alumni community. And I think, Anirudh, you were talking about the Kennedy School, and it seems like all of you are, in fact, alumni of Kennedy School, or at least Kennedy School in Srishti's case. Um, but so I think ever since you graduated, I believe in 2016, you have taken on at least three leadership roles in different Harvard communities, alumni communities. You are, I think, the current president of the Harvard W3D, the Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development. I think you were also the president for the HKS, the Kennedy School New England Association. And then you were also previously co-chair for the HKS Women's Network, I believe. That's a lot. And I think on top of that, you're also very actively engaged in the local politics and community organizing in Cambridge, where Harvard is situated. Um, so I think I want to ask you, well, first of all, how do you manage to do all of that at the same time? And second of all, what are some key agendas now that you're looking to, looking for a role in the HAA's board? What are some key agendas that you hope to bring to the table in the board, which I believe will be sort of influence or have their roots in all of these engagements that you've had with the community so far?
That sounds great. So, yeah, and in terms of what I'm hoping to accomplish on the board, I think that Harvard has incredible power and therefore a real responsibility to create a more equitable, inclusive, accessible, and just society. Harvard needs to play a role in a central role, really, in conversations and substantive efforts to advance this society. And I think that the work that I've been doing through the three Harvard alumni groups that you mentioned, the HKS Women's Network, Harvard W3D Women in Defense, Diplomacy, and Development, and the HKS New England Alumni Association, looks to elevate conversations that really bring public service to the fore and also diverse communities. I'm very proud to be endorsed by the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard. And I also think that this role, serving on the HAA board of directors, really would be a continuation of a lot of the work I've already been doing in connecting Harvard alumni groups and alumni generally. And I'd love to continue doing that work, specifically with a focus on the global South or the majority world, where conversations are often either, let's say, less well populated, where I think there really isn't adequate conversation, given how much is happening in those spaces. So looking forward to hopefully having this opportunity to further connect Harvard alumni groups and individuals in service of a safer, healthier, and more diverse world. So it's a little bit about how my current board positions and board leadership work connect to how I view serving on the HA board of directors. And then to your question about time management, I actually have been running these time management and email organizing workshops. And I actually did one a few weeks ago. I've had about 3,000 people attend in the last 2 years. I started organizing them spring 2021, so exactly 2 years ago, even. And I have a whole bunch of like tips there about how I organize time, because I have so many different roles that I play. And so I would encourage folks, if they want to learn more, to attend those workshops. But just a few things include like managing an inbox and being sort of thoughtful about managing responsibilities and organizing documentation in folders so that they're easier to find. But I actually have a lot of notes about that, and I can send them to you after too. Oh, and just a note that I am also a Harvard College graduate from 2012.
Great. Thank you. And I think I'll definitely pick you up on the suggestion for your time management course because I really need that.
Yeah,
um,
as well.
I
yeah,
think we need a second podcast on that. I think we just need to do a whole podcast
I
on,
think it's a
Theo's
good
time
idea.
management.
So, yes. But I think I really liked what you brought up, Theo, about elevating the voices from the global south. And I think this sort of connects with Srishti's point about how Harvard is and needs to be a global place. I think I want to ask you, Srishti, because I think in our previous conversation, you've also, and you just previously also mentioned that, you want to see Harvard sort of bring more global perspective in campus. And I think, as you are looking to be in the board of overseers, given the function of the board through its visitation process, how it, sort of influences the curriculum, you might have sort of some influence and power in making that happen, like in pushing that agenda at Harvard. Could you elaborate more on why do you think, first of all, a global perspective is important for all graduates to have, regardless of what schools they go to? And how specifically do you think you can sort of advocate for that in your leadership role, perhaps in the Board of Overseers, if you are elected?
Thank you, Vivek. It's a great question. And I go back to Harvard's two-part mission. One is to educate future citizens and citizen leaders of the world. Um, but the second part of the mission is really on generating knowledge that matters. And I think the global perspective is important on both fronts, to make sure that we are educating citizens of the world, and educating citizens who actually will be occupying countries around the world. I mean, as Anirudh said, and I think Theo and Anirudh and I all experienced at the Kennedy School, our classmates come from everywhere. I think the Kennedy School happens to be one of the most global talent pools in terms of the students who attend. Um, and so that's definitely a big piece of it. But I think the other part in the knowledge that matters, Theo said something which I think really resonates with me, which is around, I mean, how do we involve communities that are affected in terms of the research and the policies and the work that we're doing across all of the Harvard schools, whether that be public health or life sciences or in applied physics. We need to really be thinking about how we're involving, where does this research go, and that's where I think the alumni community plays a huge role for Harvard, and why I think Harvard is very special in the two boards, both the very active alumni association, but also because of that very active alumni association, we have um, the ability to nominate and elect every seat on the Board of Overseers. So our Board of Overseers is very special at Harvard because it is both nominated and elected entirely by alumni. And that alumni, in my mind, is really the life connection to the world around us. And why is it important? I mean, I think we've lived through several things in our lifetimes, even as people on this in this podcast, that show us how global the world is. The pandemic isn't over anywhere until it's over everywhere, right? I think we just got the word from the WHO and the pandemic sort of moving into a more endemic situation. But that wouldn't have happened, until we realized that it's a situation everywhere. I think geopolitics is affecting us, the availability of energy and oil across borders and boundaries. Our supply chains are incredibly global, and we've seen the impact of that. So I think appreciation of how world is so interconnected and global is really important for students across all schools. because there is no sort of isolated existence. And back to your point around the overseers, I mean, I really see the role of the board of overseers participation in the visitation process. And maybe just a second on visitation, it doesn't really sound like a word I really would have known a lot about as a new graduate of the university, but it's really the external assessment. So every department, division, and school at Harvard goes through a periodic external assessment by standing committees. There's over 50 standing committees for the university, and the overseers direct and sit on those standing committees. And their role is to ask questions and bring perspectives. And those perspectives are meant to say, do we have the right students here? How are our faculty? What are they working on? How are we promoting? Who are we promoting in the faculty process? What does the curriculum look like for those who are concentrating or focusing on something? And how does the curriculum look like for those who are not focusing and concentrating in those areas? What critical skills and things do we want to be bringing to people? So I think that there is a huge role when you bring different perspectives together in a total board. There's 30 members of the Board of Overseers. And I think it's important to bring a lot of people together who have different views and different experiences, so that when they're sitting on those standing committees, there is the ability to raise and bring questions, to Theo's point, to the forefront and say, hey, how are we thinking about the fact that our gender balance on this faculty is not where we want it to be? Or are we bringing the right students into this curriculum? We're all three Kennedy School graduates. There's a huge discussion right now on combining several of the programs. So how did that come about, and why would we want to do that? And I'm sure that was a big conversation that the visitation process led to from the Kennedy School. So just some of those thoughts. And I don't know, Theo, you might want to jump in because there's lots of overlap with things you were saying.
I mean, I think you did a great job highlighting it all. Just that there's such an important, it's very important that we include globally representative voices and voices looking to elevate under discussed, but also important conversations. And I would love to be a part of that.
Mhm. And I also totally agree. I think just, going back to my own recent experience, I feel very privileged that I was given an opportunity as an international student to be in several Harvard classrooms and, bring forth my unique perspective. And I think I also greatly benefited from classmates from around the world who did bring their own perspectives, and definitely including those voices in the curriculum, and making sure the research speaks to the communities that they're intended to. I think that's really important. So thank you, Srishti, for bringing that up and for also explaining the role of the Board of Overseers and the visitation process. I think that was very informative. And I think I want to come back, if we have time, to some of the points you brought up, mostly about the interdisciplinary nature of education and why that is so important. But I think going back to the idea of global perspective and how challenges, especially today, are so global that we do need um, global perspectives and countries and people around the world working together on these problems. And one of such big problems that comes to my mind, and I think is apparent, and everyone's thinking about it, especially Anirudh. You talk a lot about climate change, and you write about it. I think you work in policy related to climate change. You support startups and entrepreneurs who are sort of bringing in different ways to combat climate change. And this is one of the truly global problems that we face today. And there's a lot of things we can talk about it, but what do you think is the role of educational institutions like Harvard, especially one that leverages a lot of power and influence through not only its research and science, but through its alumni community, influence in policy, and influence in the work that really happens in the ground? What do you think is the role of educational institutions like Harvard in tackling problems like climate change?
Yeah. No, thanks, Vivek. That's something obviously very close to my heart and my day-to-day work. Um, I can think of at least three things, right, that an educational institution can do. One is obviously educate. right? The second is, I think, research. And I would say third is engage its own alumni, right, to do positive work. So let me expand a little bit on each of those three. Educate, today it's very evident that climate change is a problem spanning the entire world and spanning all classes of society, all groups in society. It's not something that's exclusive to one country, one region, or one group of society, right? So, and one of the biggest gaps that you find today, and which unfortunately permeates into debates, policy debates as well, is lack of a common understanding on many things related to climate, right? From climate change deniers, right? On one end, to people who worry about climate change a lot. There's a lot of people in that spectrum who sometimes just don't know or don't have a framework to understand what's going on, right? And I was, to be honest, like even as I started investing in climate tech startups, I realized that even my understanding was very limited, right? My understanding of even what climate technology should entail. In India, I can give you an example. In fact, I just had a podcast that I did earlier in the day because I work with this think tank, as Theo also knows, for Carnegie India, on this issue that climate technology has to be very broadly envisioned. Climate technology is not just about, let's say, electric mobility. In India right now, EVs are the buzzword, and everyone's thinking about EVs, either buying or policy frameworks, subsidies, etc. But climate is really going to entail agriculture as well. Climate is also going to entail a lot of data analytics work, right? Climate is going to entail green buildings. Climate is not just about green hydrogen as a potential new fuel, but it's also take a lot of existing technology. And I can go on about this, but the point I'm trying to make is that there's a massive amount of education that educational institution like Harvard can do about how to mitigate, make communities more resilient, to the point that I think Srishti and Theo were discussing. Resilience and adaptation to climate change for communities that are at most risk is going to be a massive issue also. So educate is a big piece. Second is research. Research today, so much research is needed for policy, but even for technological innovation. So I think universities like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Columbia, a bunch of these Ivy League universities are also setting up climate schools or climate divisions or climate programs. But it really has to permeate a much bigger set of institutions globally so that everyone's doing research from their perspective, whether it's tech research, policy research, so on and so forth. Third, I think, is alumni. So, over the last few years, obviously, Harvard has had many debates internally and externally on what the university's own responsibilities are when it comes to climate change. From how the endowment invests, right, to the programs at Harvard, etc. And I think one thing that is maybe missing, and that's something I would love to try and do more, is how do we engage alumni in their individual capacities across the world to make sure that their respective organizations are doing enough on climate. Right? One thing is about what Harvard does as a university, but I think it's also incumbent upon the 400,000 of us as leaders in our respective spaces to do more. Right? So I would say at least these three things I think we could do more on.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, I think those are key elements that a university can at least do, and I think Harvard does have a lot of potential to act in all of those areas. And I hope it does more in this field because it's urgent. It's very important that we act. Theo, I think while we're talking about this from more of a global perspective and taking actions on a global level, I was wondering if you could help us sort of connect this to the local level, because I think you are especially engaged in the local community. I mentioned in Cambridge, you were engaged in organizing uh, the local people. I think you run a nonprofit that is a network of the local businesses. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the objectives of supporting local economy is that it's beneficial to the environment, among many other things. So not just being limited to climate change, but plethora of global problems that we face today. How do you think we can connect the global and the local? Where does the local come in? How important is that? And how do you think institutions like Harvard can support work at the local level?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, I mean, ultimately, for many of us, it's easiest to have impact at the local level because our local elected officials and institutions that operate locally are ones that we have the greatest access to and ultimately the greatest potential to impact. And so, while I do certainly work at the international level, I also do a lot of work locally to complement that because I do believe that each of us has a responsibility to take action locally. So, that can take a lot of different forms. Like you noted, I run a nonprofit. It's called Cambridge Local First. We support locally and independently owned businesses for a whole bunch of different reasons. But one of those reasons is, like you say, that local institutions actually have a much smaller environmental footprint than big companies do, and that's for a few reasons. Part of that is because they consume less land, they tend to carry more locally made products, they locate closer to residents, and they create less traffic and air pollution. And so we encourage folks to shop locally because um, per unit of consumption, it has a much smaller environmental footprint. We also have partnerships with local green organizations like Green Cambridge, where right now, actually, we're working on our City Nature Art Challenge, where we're encouraging students to depict nature around them in artwork, and winning submissions will be posted to local businesses in Cambridge. So that's an example, but there's also local of education and sort of consumption as part of that ecosystem. There's also local policy. So, for example, recently debated in the Cambridge city government has been policies like BUDO, the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, which requires buildings to track energy use and consumption and output for the purpose of ultimately trying to reduce energy use and energy consumption. As well as the implementation of protected bicycle lanes, which create safer bicycling experiences so that more people can choose bicycling as a transit or transportation option and move away from individual like car transit as their primary transportation option. So those are just some examples of climate relevant policies or environmentally focused policies that happen at the local level that Cambridge Local First, my nonprofit, has been involved in advocating around and pushing for. And I think it's important to recognize that Harvard is a real stakeholder as one of the largest landowners and also employers in Cambridge. Cambridge has, the city government has a committee called Economic Development and University Relations for that very reason. So the committee on city council that's focused on economic development is also the one that manages the relationship with Harvard. And so Harvard definitely, as the biggest or one of the biggest employers and landowners in the city, has an important role to play in advancing more sustainable climate policies at the local level.
Amazing. Thank you for bringing that perspective. I think that was really needed. Srishti, I saw you've been taking a lot of notes. Do you want to come in? Do you have any comments? Is there
Well,
any angle that I'm missing here?
well, I mean, I know our listeners are out there, and I listened to the first episode with Stephen, which was excellent. And I would actually love to hear from Anirudh and Theo a little bit um, the vast nature of what constitutes global development, because we're going to have listeners who are early in their careers or mid in their careers or somewhere along their paths in their careers. And how do you think about what is a career that contributes to global development, and how is your own view maybe changed over time? I just find I just find it very fascinating both to hear a little bit about the journeys, but also this is a very broad term. And I thought Stephen's, sort of journey was so interesting. And maybe our listeners would like to hear a little bit about kind of where we landed and or how our thinking is evolving in global development,
Mhm.
because I think this might be something our listeners are also kind of working through.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing that question. And I think even personally, I'm very interested and intrigued about knowing what your journeys have been and, your different interesting experiences along the way in the field of global development. So please answer that question, Anirudh and Theo.
Theo, why don't you go first?
Okay, sure. So I think that engagement on issues of global development can take a lot of different forms. When I started out my career, I actually worked in development settings with nonprofit organizations. So I worked, for example, in the West Bank, leading summer camps for youth and refugee camps. So like providing summer enrichment opportunities for refugee youth in Palestine. I also spent time working in Morocco with nonprofits doing work around conflict resolution, community empowerment, poverty alleviation, and education. And then I spent time working in Turkey where I was doing education and also education work and refugee studies work in the southeast of Turkey and Kurdish Iraq. And so I think doing work directly with nonprofits or intergovernmental organizations in places that can benefit from further economic development or conflict resolution or some kind of issue like that is certainly one example. More recently, my work has taken a different form. So the last few years, I've been working at Twitter in technology policy. And so what that means is different, but also I think equally as important. So, for example, when I worked at Twitter before I got laid off a few weeks ago, I managed a helpline for human rights defenders and journalists globally to escalate issues that they were facing. So this could have included like impersonation issues or health, hate speech, abuse, mis and disinformation, etc. With organizations like Access Now, Frontline Defenders, and Article 19, and GLAAD, which does LGBT work. And I also was doing research looking at how issues like online gender-based violence and crisis response affect stakeholders, specifically in the developing world or the majority world or the global south, and helping to create policies that elevated voices in those spaces and also like created safer online spaces specifically for marginalized communities. And then since I left Twitter, I've continued doing that work. So for example, I've been working with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace or the National Democratic Institute and the Committee to Protect Journalists on issues like mis and disinformation, online gender-based violence, which is a real issue and undermines women's political participation globally, and journalist safety. And all of those are issues that are very important in developing country contexts. So, like I said, it really can take a lot of different forms, but all of the work is important, I think.
Mm-hmm. Anirudh, do you want to come in?
So absolutely, I think I generally agree with the broad point that I think Theo has made, right? That I think the way you engage with the field of global development will evolve. Your own understanding of what constitutes development or global development will evolve, right? As a student, I remember when I was in my undergrad, which was at a small liberal arts college outside Philadelphia called Haverford, my understanding of development came from the perspective I'd had in India, where I thought that conflict was hampering development in places like Kashmir in India, for example. Um, and so for me, the way I thought about development was how do you resolve conflict or ethnic conflict in particular, right, or religious conflict. And from that point, I spent a few years thinking about literally how conflict is a big hampering effect on development. But a few years later, when I was working with McKinsey, um, my understanding of development or my perspective on development changed. It started to become a lot more about how do you enable governments or businesses to do better, to scale more, to become more efficient, so that their intended objectives are executed upon, right? So if governments want to have an efficient tax administration so that they can carry out development works, how can you help governments become more efficient tax administrators? For example, is one of the projects I worked on at McKinsey, right? And then take that forward, like I worked with the Indian government, and then suddenly I got a very different perspective on development. I worked with the IT or the tech ministry in India in 2009-10, and I started to see how an emerging technology at that time, which was internet and smartphones, how the adoption or penetration of that technology is a massive job for the government, right? And India embarked on this massive scheme that time called the Common Service Center scheme, which was to try and get internet cafes in every local village cluster in India across the country, right? Which is over 600,000 of these clusters. And how do you ensure that this is not just on paper, but actually effective? And then more recently, it's been for the last decade, I would say it's been from a venture capital and startup perspective, where I think my perspective has now been how do you enable grounds up entrepreneurship to be unlocked, to power development, entrepreneurship, and job and wealth creation in a country. Which I think, as Theo was trying to say, through a job at Twitter, etc., it's a very different perspective now. So the perspective is now, okay, how do you enable tech, innovation, ideas to emerge and scale up so that development is no longer the responsibility of a select few, right? It's not top down, it's bottoms up, right? So the perspectives on development really change. And I guess the last perspective I've gained over the last few years is as an author. So I published this book last year, and I've been working with Carnegie Endowment as well, like Theo is, in India at least. And the work I'm doing there is a lot more on just idea generation, on policy inputs, right? So that some of the things that otherwise hamper the ability of a country to unleash entrepreneurship, how can you unlock those, or unshackle those people and institutions, right? To empower global development. Climate is again another piece, right? Where if we have global development, but we don't have sustainable global development, right? Or global development that reaches those who need it most, we are again recreating a world that was unequal to begin with. And then you think about, okay, what have you contributed to the world's development if you've just enabled that unequal structures to continue, right? So I think, as I think Theo also made, I think the bigger point is your perspectives on global development, or the ways in which you will engage with global development, will evolve in your career. But because it's such a broad field, you'll end up coming at it from very different standpoints. But in a way, you want to keep connecting the dots in your head somewhere or the other.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think those are all very important perspectives. I'm curious, Srishti, what about you? How do you approach development? Has it evolved over the years? How you understand and act in this field? Yeah, please. I'd love to hear your experience and thoughts.
Thanks, Vivek. A lot of parallels actually to Theo and Anirudh's experiences. I mean, I even started much more narrow when I first came into thinking about the Kennedy School. I was I was doing medicine with a big focus on global health. And then within global health, it was around the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, which looked very different than it looked like in the United States. And health systems were not even able to do the treatment and testing scale ups that that would be necessary. But it was only after arriving at the Kennedy School that I realized that we wouldn't make any advancements in anything health wise until we put those into broader community development, economic development. I mean, communities have to be just, more free, more equitable. Jobs, education has to be there. And focusing on one small slice of health was never going to be sustainable or um, helpful in terms of elevating where people wanted to be. And many of the choices that were made in health were not because of bad science. They were made because of structural issues that really, poverty was driving a lot of the bad outcomes in health and education. And when I first started my career, I focused very much into the public-private partnership space and the donor aid space, and thinking that that was a huge amount of money coming in into global development, and then just understanding how that would work and how to bring the interdisciplinary aspects to that, the policies, the involvement of community voices and affected communities into the large grants that were going out. But I have to say, similar to Theo and Anirudh, I also had an evolution over time. Now I spend a lot of my time with Norskin, which is an impact investing foundation. And there's two parts to Norskin. One is really trying to help startups in the impact space with the idea that we need to find impact unicorns. So it doesn't matter what your valuation is, but if you touch a billion lives, then you're an impact unicorn. And I love that notion in some ways because uh, the market-based solutions of customers have to, show up every day. You get voted in every day. It's not an election. It's not, something where you get to have a long period of time. it's the usage on a daily basis that decides, do you have an impact of a billion people? And so I love this notion of kind of, looking for things. And they have this saying at Norskin, which I love, is if they win, we all win, right? Because if we can find these guys who are doing this great work and doing this entrepreneurship in health tech or ed tech or fintech or climate tech, like we all win. And then the other part of Norskin is creative financing vehicles to kind of figure out and support organizations. So I spent some time mentoring founders in health tech and ed tech. And similar to Anirudh's experience with entrepreneurship, I think there's a huge amount of value that we didn't necessarily untap early enough in some of the early history of development aid that we're now figuring out a much better way to do. And so my evolution in global development has tried to really think about how do we support entrepreneurship in the context of all the other things, the budgeting that needs to happen in country governments and the regulatory environments and the policies, but elevating the role of the possible role of market-based solutions through entrepreneurs is, I think, is a huge part of the solution space.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing up that question, Srishti, and for everyone for answering that. I think because especially I'm in early stages of my career, I'm very curious in how people's careers evolve. And especially, I think all of you have had such varied experiences and you work in so many different fields, in very interdisciplinary, pathways. I was just curious, what have been the driver of the choices you make, or what have been those questions that you've asked yourself in different times in your career to sort of pick your path, to choose your priorities, choose the issues that you want to work towards. Yes, I'd love to hear how your careers have evolved and what have been those driving questions for you.
Yeah, no, Vivek, I think that's a great question. I'll take a quick crack at this. I think it evolves with your career, right? Your decision making criteria, or what uh, motivates you, etc. With your decisions related to your career evolves. I would say at the beginning of my career, it was definitely where what institution or what career or what field would give me the most learning, right? For me, I think early in my career, that was definitely the main motivating factor for me. Where will I learn the most, or where will I get to work with the people I admire or respect the most? I think now, let's say couple of decades in, I would say that the motivating factors for me, or the way I think about it, is, it's most best captured by this concept of ikigai, which is also my screensaver on my computer, which is this concept that says, actually, it's a Japanese concept. Some of you might be familiar with it, which basically tries to guide you to that intersection of what you love, I think what you're good at, what you can be paid for, but also what the world needs. Right. So it's the intersection of those four that I try to use as my guiding decision making criteria to decide what I want to spend the most amount of my time, energy, and focus on.
I love that. Thank you. I want to go back to that principle that you mentioned. Theo, Srishti, what about you?
Yeah. I've always had a really hard time like articulating motivation. I know very strongly when a course of action resonates and when it doesn't, but it's sort of hard to describe or articulate the underlying motivation. I will say I think folks can benefit from being honest with themselves about what work really does resonate with them and what work doesn't. That's something that I've tried consistently to do, and also not to stare at closed doors when they close. And so the world is so full of opportunities that when an opportunity is no longer accessible to us, something that I've tried consistently to do is to just jump back from that by looking at new opportunities. So, for example, in recent weeks, I was laid off from my job, and I've been throwing myself into new communities, doing work at the intersection of society and technology or in responsible tech, and also looking at new spaces like artificial intelligence, which is going to be, we haven't discussed it here, but definitely an issue that I'm learning a lot about these days and hoping to transition more into in the days to come, especially because it will have significant distributional effects in the majority world. And so it's very relevant for this conversation. So I think that both being honest with ourselves and also really like ruthlessly prioritizing forward looking opportunities as opposed to reflecting on those doors that have closed behind us. Those are two things, like two sort of general approaches that I've tried to take in my career and that I think have been very useful for me and then for others as well in my circles.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's really helpful. I think I really love your point about how we need to be forward looking and be open, because I also feel that things are evolving so fast. New technologies are coming in, and there's new learning. And again, going back to the idea of lifelong learning and why that is so important, and how alumni communities like we are in right now can support that. So yes, I think that's really good. Srishti, what advice would you have, or what reflections do you have in terms of how your career has shaped over the years?
Maybe more reflections than advice. Maybe it's terrible and nobody should follow it. But I think a few things guide me as I think about stuff. So in our culture of Indian descent, our elders are very important to us, and um, I come from with grandparents and my husband's side. I've known my husband for a long time now. We have come from our grandparents were not incredibly educated, and so but they are incredibly loving and high moral compass people, and in their lives, and they raised great families, and now their kids are all educated and getting PhDs and MDs and all of these things who are our parents, and so I think often of going back to the if can I explain this to Paki, or can I explain this to Nani, and like can they understand what am I doing, and like what would if I simplify it down to like what Pati thinks, like would Pati be proud of me, like would Pati say that's a good thing, you're doing a good thing, you're helping things, and just in the frame of reference of whatever education and whatever things she had, she's no longer with us, but like what would Pati think is kind of one of the things I always ask myself. I think the other is just energy from people. I think both Theo and Anirudh said this, like the people you work with people, and like, it could be a bad idea and great people, and you can still, the idea will evolve into a good idea with good people. And so I think people is a really important part of, what is the chemistry like? How do I feel? And then I think something from my medicine days that I will always carry with me is that first part of the Hippocratic Oath, which is, do no harm. And so, does it check that in my gut? Like, I love, Theo, your point around, there's just somatic decision making that we make, and it doesn't have to be articulated, but you feel it. And I think the do not harm part is definitely is is the somatic thing for me as well, as like, do you feel like you're not doing any harm in where you're going or who you're working with or what you're doing? And that changes over time, but like that's a gut check for me that I'd like to do as well.
Hmm. That's great. I really especially love this idea of being able to explain to your grandparents. I think it's at least credited to Einstein that he said, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, then you don't know it yourself. So I think really making it simple and going back to the basics, is it good work? I think is a guiding principle that I can take away for myself, at least. Um, well, I think we're out of time that I asked of you. So I think I want to conclude this. But thank you so much. This has been a privilege and amazing opportunity. Thank you for joining. Best of luck with the elections, and I hope the results are favorable. And I know even if it's regardless of whether you are in the board or not, you're already leading the Harvard alumni community in amazing ways, and you'll continue to do so. And I hope to really have another opportunity to chat with you again. Any parting words? You're welcome to share.
No, thank you for doing this. Thank
Just a big thank you. Thank you, Vivek. And really, Theo, Anirudh, great getting to know you even more. We've done a few of these now together, and I feel like every time we get to learn more about each other, it's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I'll add, I second that, Srishti, and I'll also add, Vivek, that I think it's a great idea for Six to do this kind of podcast because I think various Six could learn from this. It's a great way to engage with alumni and obviously involve members of your SIG so that they can also learn more about each other. I think it's a great idea that you've started this podcast.
Yeah.
That's not just me, but thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Thank you, listeners, for listening in, and we'll see you at the next podcast.